sponsors for the week, Mr. Loiterman of Norfolk, Virginia, in honor of the Yomi Shiur, and the Kahal Yereim Daf Yomi program. Also, Rabbi Glenn Black, who's sponsoring this week with Zecher Nishmas Nechemia Ben Yaakov, Zichrono Livracha, and today's Daf sponsor of Jeffrey and Chava de la Wald, Vizchus a refuah shlema for Ephraim Ben Shifra. We are amidst a 5-answer question. Question was, we had a brisa. Brisa tells us that somebody comes forward. There's a dispute on a piece of property, and somebody comes forward and says, I have a contract. I also have a chazaka that proves that this land is mine. So the argument between Rabbi Shimon Gamliel and Rabbi was that Rabbi says that we're gonna go with a contract. You're gonna need to be able to justify that contract. Shimon Gamliel says we're gonna use this chazaka. Let me just clip this on for the sake of making sure it doesn't fall off the table. Okay. The AV people don't get worried and nervous the whole year. And we first wanted to explain, right? First answer we tried to explain was this is a argument about osios niknos b'mesira, whether the contract is going to actually automatically affect the transference. And therefore, according to Rebbe, he says it does. That's why showing the contract is going to be the most effective method. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, well, if the contract simply says so-and-so gave it to so-and-so, this contract isn't the most useful thing. We're going to really want to know your chazaka, which that's going to be more useful. But we said that that's not a great answer, because if that were the answer, then Rabbi Shimon Gamliel would wind up being a contradiction on himself, because we had on Kuf Samach Tes on the top Kuf Samach Tes Amud Aleph, we had Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said that that if a gift contract is given over to somebody and then he gives it back, that the gift returns as well. It shows that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is the one who holds of this idea that the contract giving over of the contract is equivalent to giving over the land itself. If this explanation were correct over here, we would have Rabbi Shimon Gamliel holding the opposite. Right. We don't like that. So therefore we said, no, we'll try a different explanation. Really what the argument about whether, and we are now not talking about Shtar Mesira, whether we're going to hold this Osios Niknos Ben Mesira, that's, we started this conversation in order just to bring this answer, but now we're going to go on to multiple other answers. We tried to say, well, maybe the argument is where the contract had an invalid witness on it. If the contract had an invalid witness on it, so the argument is, according to Rebbe, the contract is still very useful to us because we don't care really about what's written in the contract or the witnesses signed on the contract. What affects transference of land is the act of giving over the contract. And therefore, there are witnesses who saw this contract being given over. Those are not the same witnesses as the ones who signed the contract. So what's written in the contract or the witnesses that are on the contract are not very important to Rebbe. He says that what's important in the contract is the witnesses who saw it get handed over. Therefore, when he says you've got to justify the contract, he's saying call in the witnesses who saw it being handed over, and you're in great shape. Whereas Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is going to say, no, the contract has to be signed by real witnesses, and so therefore this contract has no validity to it. I need to see a chazaka. I need to be able to prove this chazaka in order to establish ownership. That was problematic because we said, okay, that is a fine answer. However, the challenge there is that what if the contract itself has bad witnesses on it? It sort of seems to indicate that there was a problem with the contract. It's not the same thing as having saying that there's something wrong with the contract. We don't mind so much. This contract actually has bad witnesses written on it. That's where we're picking up. Yeah. We're going to discuss this issue, right?
I don't want to ask before question.
Yes.
Nobody's concerned about what's in the contract. If it's
now, what's in the contract does have to say the loan, right? The contract does have, it does, but the witnesses are not that important. We're going to even see that the date doesn't wind up being all that critical of all those things because the transaction dates, the witnesses, those are all about when the contract was handed over, who witnessed the contract being handed over. Obviously, if the contract says, a completely different deal having nothing to do with this transaction, that's not going to be acceptable. You need to be able to have a document. The document itself has to have some sort of, relationship to this transaction, right? And when this argument is originally brought up, it's in the Sefer Gittin. It's relating mostly to a divorce contract. So the divorce contract has to have all of the effective rules of a divorce contract, but they argue over some qualities of a divorce contract, whether they're required or not. For example, whether the date is required, whether the witnesses being signed on that contract are required. So that's going to be dependent on this argument. But you can't say like just hand over a blank piece of paper and say people witness the blank piece of paper. That's not witnessing anything, right? It still has to be a divorce contract. But what's in the divorce contract could be different between the two opinions. So Ella Amar Rabbi Avina says, and this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 lines down. Ella Amar Ravina at the beginning of the line. Hakol modim shim kasev bo who's kaknu le'edusan shel edim v'nimtzis edusan mezuyefes shu pasal. Everyone agrees that if this document, even though we might suggest that handing over the contract is what is important, if this contract has invalid witnesses and we are suggesting that we are dependent on these witnesses and they did write their names on this contract, that will actually be worse. That can ruin a contract because the fact that we wrote bad witnesses on the contract may have been intentional in order to cause harm to the contract and prove that the deal was never valid. Like the Abba says, it's sure puzzle. The argument is only when there's no witnesses at all in the contract. If there's no witnesses at all, there's nobody who's really knocking this contract. There's nobody supporting the contract. Therefore, we can rely on the witnesses of handing the contract over. When you have bad witnesses, that might be worse than no witnesses, right? Which is to contrast what we said once before about filling in the blank space where we wanted to have invalid witnesses might be better than leaving it blank.
Whether it's your brother or son or whatever.
That one, that's what we said over there. Here it's a little bit different because these are the only witnesses that are signed on this contract. The Rebbe now, so we're going to suggest, this is our third suggested answer now to distinguish it between the second one where we said there were actually bad witnesses on it. We're now going to adjust that answer slightly and say this might be a circumstance where there are no witnesses on the contract. Because in that circumstance, the Rebbe Savar looked Rebbe Elazar Damar 80 Masira Karsi. Rebbe Elazar is now going to hold that now that we don't have bad witnesses ruining the contract, there's just no witnesses on the contract. Rebbe is going to say, well, as long as I've got witnesses that the contract was handed over, then that contract's effective. Which is why Rebbe holds that in order to prove ownership of the land, I'm going to want to see that contract. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Savar law, Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is going to hold like Rabbi Meir, Damar 80 Hasima Karsi, that you need to have a kosher signature on a contract in order to certify that contract. And that's what makes contracts valid is the signature on the bottom. If that is the case, this contract having no signatures is not useful to me. I would like for this person to prove that he's been living on the property for 3 years. And that's what's going to be useful to me to prove his ownership. And that's why they have the argument whether you're going to bring this contract or you're going to bring the chazaka, because one is going to say this contract has meaning and one's going to say the contract is not really helpful to me. Okay? The e-bais ema b'mode b'shtar shekosbu tzarech l'kaimo kamiflagi. If you want, I've got another answer for you. Answer number 4. I could have a circumstance where we can dust off one of our old arguments, the argument about when a person admits to the contract, and he says, and he adds on potentially an explanation for why, even though the contract is valid, he explains why he doesn't really owe the money or why this transaction was invalid, whether that is sufficient to certify this contract, and we now don't care anymore what the guy has to say, or whether we're going to say that even once somebody says, I admit to the contract, you still have to be able to bring an outside source to certify this contract. Why? Because of the concept we said of pesha asur pesha hitter. If you're the guy who admits this contract is valid, but I already paid, for example, this is a valid contract, but I already paid. Well, you have to either decide whether you're listening to me or you're not listening to me. If you're listening to me, then I already paid. If you're not listening to me, then who certified the contract in the first place? So therefore, I'm going to need some outside evidence that this contract is valid. On the other hand, the other side says, no, once a person says this is a valid contract, but we say, stop right there. This is a contract. Once you've admitted the contract, the second part of your statement, you'd better be ready to prove that. So this argument about whether a contract, when somebody admits to a contract, whether you need outside certification of that contract or that person's own admission is sufficient, was an argument we had before, and it could be the argument here. That could be what's going on in this case. This fellow is coming along and saying, sure, I have this contract is a valid contract, but ... Rebbe's going to say that once the fellow admitted it was a valid contract, once this seller admitted the contract was valid, you can say, sure, that was a valid contract, but I never intended to hand the land over. We never sold it in the end. We just wrote this contract or whatever his claim is. Once he said this is a valid contract, his second part of his claim, we don't worry about that because he's just admitted to this contract. which makes this contract valid, which is why Rabbi says, just show me this contract. That's going to prove the deal is done, because the seller is admitting that there's a contract here. And
has there ever been a time where the contract was kosher really wasn't?
That could happen a lot, because somebody could say a contract's kosher and it really wasn't. That's why we're trying to prove these things with the witnesses and everything, right? We want to be able to make sure that we verify that all those things are true. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel holds tzarich lekaimo. He holds that you do need to certify it, and therefore the fact that this fellow is saying it's a valid contract, but I never sold the land or whatever it is, makes his contract need an external verification. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, without an external verification, this contract is going to be helpful to me. You know what would be better? Show me the chazaka. If you show me the chazaka, then I'm happy. Okay. Now, the problem with this is, again, when we bring these outside arguments, we have to be able to make sure that our opinions align with other sources. And we're going to learn that these opinions are actually flipped. The Tanya, we learned in a brayso. Let's say I have two people, and they're both holding on to a contract. One's holding on this side, one's holding on this side. So, Malva Omer Shalihu, the one who's the lender, he says, this is my contract, many, and I dropped it, umatzaso, and I found it. So now that's why I'm picking it up. And the only reason you're grabbing onto the other end is because you saw me picking up my contract and you tried to grab it from me without paying. That's my claim. The Lova Omar, and the Lova, the borrower says, Shalchahu, you're right, it was a valid contract, uparativ, but I've paid it already. So, upartiv lecha, I've already paid you. So, Yiskaima Shar Bechosmav, Divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says, let's certify this contract. Now, what's Rebbe saying? By certifying the contract, we're going to be, without certifying the contract, the fact that the borrower says it's a valid contract, but doesn't mean enough, right? That's not going to be enough. He still has to certify this contract. Once you certify the contract, sounds like he's going to be able to collect. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Yachloku, no, you don't need to certify. This contract is already certified. It's good enough. Why? Because the borrower is admitting it, so therefore you split it. Now here's where it's reversed, because now Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is the one who's saying that the contract is valid just by the person admitting it, whereas in the case where we said Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was the one who said, I want to see the chazaka because this contract isn't going to have validity. Well, you can't flip the opinions, right? You just flipped Rebbe and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. The Havinon Ba, and we explained this Mishnah in Bava Mitzia, right? I already sort of explained it, right? We explained this. Havinon Ba. Veles le Rebbe ha ditnan. Doesn't Rebbe hold? We learned to explain according to this. Doesn't Rebbe agree? Why would Rebbe hold that we need to bring certification on the contract? What about the fact that it says in our Mishnah, Shnai moksim betalis, right? Those who are familiar, two people are holding on to a talis. Zelmer ani mitzasia, v'zelmer ani mitzasia. One says, I found it first. The other one says, no, I found it first. Zeyishava she'ein lo b'pachos mechatzia. They flip a coin. They can't flip a coin because one is right, one is wrong. Flipping a coin doesn't help you, right? One is going to get it wrong. So this one is going to swear, I own no less than half of it. And this one is going to swear that and then you split it.
Right, but I'm saying this is all mine.
Both of them are saying that here too.
Not in the contract. One's saying, yes, this is a valid contract.
But not anymore, but I paid, so it's all mine now.
Oh, I see.
Right? It's all mine. They're both claiming it's all mine, right?
One is saying it's mine to hold on to, one is saying it's mine to rip apart.
Correct. That's correct. So they're both claiming the whole thing. V'amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. So Rava said in the name of Nachman, he's explaining what kind of case is this contract. If this was a contract where the signatures were already, everything was already established and done, so then you're right. It would be the exact same case as the talis, right? It's just a contract. This contract represents the loan. You're holding half, I'm holding half. There's no way to know who gets it, so we're going to split the loan. Okay? So that makes sense. That's not where the argument comes in. Ki pligi, the argument is b'she'enu mekuyim. It's like I explained it before. This is a contract that does not have the witnesses certified yet. Rabbi savar mod b'shtar shekosvu tzarich l'kaimo. Rabbi holds, which is where our problem is going to come up because it's the opposite of what we said in our brice that we're dealing with here. That Rabbi holds that when the contract is written, even though the lender, the borrower is saying, it's a valid contract, but I already paid. That is once he says, but I already paid, then it takes off the fact that he admitted it. right? I admitted it, but I already paid because pesha also pesha iter. So therefore, this contract is considered uncertified. And therefore, if the fellow who is grabbing onto the contract, who's the lender, wants to collect, he's got to bring witnesses and certify the contract that it's valid, because there is no agreement here that it's valid in the first place. If there's no agreement that this contract is valid in the first place, right? Because that's what the lender is saying. The borrower is saying. If the borrower is saying this contract has no validity, because the only reason that you believe that the contract is valid is because I said so, and I'm telling you I paid it.
That'll be puzzle.
And therefore the contract, well, it's not puzzle, it's just paid, right? Puzzle is where the contract was never valid in the first place.
So
This contract is valid, it's just already paid.
right, and but then they confirm that the contract valid.
So,
and they split it.
yes, because now that there's a valid contract, I've got two people disputing it. It's just like the talis.
Right.
Once I certify it, then I can split it. But before I certify it, I've got the guy who's the lender is holding on to essentially a piece of paper that's worth nothing. Right? So the imekayim lay. So if the lender can then certify this contract and prove it's valid, so then gabi palga, then he can collect half, right? Because now he certified the contract and collect half. Ve'ilo, if he cannot certify this contract, chas babialmahu, then it's just a piece of broken pottery. It's worthless. It's a piece of scrap paper. So then there's nothing to claim. There's nothing to do, right? Now, for Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, on the other hand, in this case, he's going to hold mod b'shtar shekasku ein tzarich l'kaimo. He's going to say that if the person, once the borrower is saying, I admit this is a valid contract, but then we just turn the mute button on. Once you've admitted the contract is valid, we don't care what your next statement is because you've just validated this contract. We don't need an external validation. You've just validated the contract. Therefore, immediately, v'yachloku, we are going to split this contract immediately based on that statement, right? So therefore, that's a good explanation of that price over there, and it's a good explanation of our price over here. The problem is that you've got Rebbe and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel reversed, right? Rebbe says on the one that we're going to allow the contract to stand with the admission of one party without the certification, and the other one says, no, you still need the certification, but we flipped the two sides. So what are we going to do? So sometimes we've seen this a few times in this parak. Flip. Okay, so flip one of them. Flip our brisa. Really, we don't want to flip a mishnah, right? We're going to flip our brisa and change our brisa so that Rebbe Shimon Gamliel is going to be the one who says that we're going to look for the shtar, and Rebbe is going to be the one who says I'm going to look for the chazaka.
Why are we now with the Mishnah?
Because the Mishnah's texts are considered to be more authentic. When Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi went through, he's almost like was an editor, and so he was looking through the texts and tried to find consistency in the texts. So we always like the text of a Mishnah a little bit stronger than we like the text of Brises, with certain exceptions. We like Reb Chia's Brises very much. There are some other Brises that have basically where there are other Rabbanim who did what Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi did and went through and made the rulings consistent. But generally, all a brisa was somebody's notes, and so therefore there could be errors that creep into them. More common. Those texts were known as less reliable. So that's an answer. Now we're going to try one more answer. V'im bois ema. Or if you want, the problem with this answer is that you have to flip Rabbi and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. It's not ideal, right? V'im bois ema liolam lo tepach. Okay, fine. Don't flip Rabbi and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. I'll give you another potential answer to why one is satisfied with the contract, one needs a chazaka. Elahacha bilivarer kamiflagi. The argument is in this concept of livarer, which means to clarify. If a person makes multiple claims, right? He thinks he's coming to court and he says, oh, I can prove it this way, and I can also prove it this way, and I prove it this way. Is he doing himself a favor or not? Because when you say and make a claim in court, we're going to see the question is going to be, does the court have the obligation to investigate every one of his claims to prove that he's correct? Okay, right? You just said you could bring witnesses. Great. The case is going to wait for you until you bring your witnesses. Well, I can't find the witnesses. I didn't even need the witnesses. I had enough of the case. But once you said you had them, now we've got to investigate to see if you're telling the truth. That's the issue here. Ki hadar of Yitzchak bar Yosef have a mosik bezuzi b'Rabbi Abba. We're going to have a lot of circumstance cases of Yitzchak bar Yosef having money by Rabbi Abba. Also, the kamed Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka. So they came before Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka to get the court case settled. Amar parasicha b'fnei ploni uploni. So he says, I paid you the loan. I returned. I paid back the loan. The claim was The lender says, you owe me money, and the borrower says, I paid back. And not only did I pay you back, but I have witnesses to the fact that I paid you back. Now, this was a regular milva al peh. It was an oral loan. Okay. There may have been witnesses to the original loan, but the rule, as we're going to see in a moment, is that when you have an oral loan, you don't, even if the loan is made in front of witnesses, you don't have to pay back in front of witnesses. Which means that if he had just simply said, I paid you back, that would have been sufficient. But now he said, I paid you back, and I had some witnesses to prove it. Samarle Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak says, Yavo ploni ploni ve'idu. Okay, go get the witnesses. And let's get them. Amar le, ilo asur lo mehimna. He says, oh, no. Why do I need to go get the witnesses? Even if I didn't bring witnesses at all, I would be believed. My case would be sufficient without the witnesses. Why do I need to go get the witnesses? Don't we know the halacha is that if somebody loans money to his friend, he does not have to pay back with witnesses present? So Amar le, so he says, so Rabbi Yitzchak says back to him and explains, he says, I, in this case, hold like the teaching of Mar, in this case. The Amar Rabbi Abba, like Rabbi Abba was Mar who was talking about. Rabbi Abba said, Amar Rabbi Ada in the name of Rabbi Ada bar Ava, Amar Rav in the name of Rav. If somebody says, I paid in front of so-and-so and so-and-so, you've got to bring those witnesses. You're the one who brought it up. If you didn't say anything, that would have been fine. But now that you brought them up, the basin has an obligation to investigate it. And the Rashbam learns, the way the Rashbam learns is, if you don't bring these witnesses, you cannot collect. Right? Other Mefarshim explain not so. That really what we're saying is lechatchila, we're going to pause the case. We're going to wait for you to go bring the witnesses. If you can't bring the witnesses, then maybe it's a lechatchila. You should bring the witnesses. But if you can't, it's still okay. Rashbam says that the Gemara basically sounds, and it does sound like that when you read the Gemara, simple reading of the Gemara, that now that you brought it up, you kind of put yourself in a difficult situation, right? You said it, so now you're going to have to prove it. The Amar of Gidol Amar Rav, didn't Rav Gidol say in the name of Rav, halacha Shimon Gamliel, that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, that you don't need to do this livarer, and so therefore, right, why are you doing it? So if Rebbe lo Amar ela livarer, and why so? Because even when Rebbe, in our mission, this price we said, even when he says we do have to do it, it almost sounds like he's suggesting that it would be ideal, right? Ideally, we would bring the contract, but maybe the chazaka would be sufficient. So Amarle ananami livarar kamino. He says no. He says I am also suggesting that what Rebbe is saying is that once you've made this extra claim, now you've got to clarify it. And so I hold like Rebbe, and so therefore you're going to have to go bring this proof. And that's why Rebbe says it's actually sort of the reverse of what we were saying before. In all of the answers that we had before, the shtar wasn't enough. I want to be able to see the chazaka. Now we're saying the chazaka would have been enough. But now that you brought up the fact that you've got a shtar, Rebbe says, well, I want to see the shtar. The chazaka should, as we said, if you live someplace for 3 years, I don't have to bring the contract. But when you walked into Basin and says, I was here for 3 years and I've got a contract, Rebbe says, I got to see that contract. Now you brought it up. That's what's going on in that argument. Okay? Next Mishnah. That's correct. Anything you say, Ken, it will be used against you. That's correct. That's correct. Says the Mishnah, Misha para mikzas chovo. Somebody has paid off part of his loan. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yachlif. Rabbi Yehuda says, you know what you should do is you should exchange contracts, right? Because the contract said you owe me $100. I paid you $50. So you know what you do? I give you the contract that said $100, tear it up, write a new contract that says $50. Right? That's a good solution. Rabbi Yossi says, Yichtov Shover. Rabbi Yossi says, no, I can write a receipt. Remember, Rabbi Yossi is the one who says we write receipts. We haven't discussed fully what the problem and the challenge of receipts are. We're going to see that now. Now we're going to be in the heavy discussion about receipts. We sort of have seen already that they present us with a few challenges.
Sometimes you can have 2 receipts.
We did say we're not going to allow 2 receipts. We're not going to have 2 deeds, right? That's for sure. Absolutely true. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Nimtza zet tzarech lios shomer shovro min akbarim. Rabbi Yehuda says, number one problem with receipts is, I'm going to tell you where the issue is. It comes out that the borrower, now, he's the one responsible for proving he's paid. Up until this point, the responsibility for proving there was a loan is on the lender. he's the one holding the contract.
Mm.
But now that the lender still has a contract that says $100, and the borrower has a receipt for $50, the borrower has to hold this contract, this receipt, in order to prevent the lender from collecting a second time. What happens if?
Was there a witness with the receipt?
Yes, there's witnesses on the receipt. It's all signed, right? But it's like every other. Correct. But now what happens if this contract? What happens if the borrower loses his contract? Or as Mishnah says, what if mice get it, right? And they eat the contract. So now he's got no proof. He's going to wind up losing. Amar lo Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, Kach yofelo velo yira kochel shozeh. He says, it's better, right? That we should strengthen the case of the lender than strengthen the case of the borrower, right? Because as we're going to see that the pasuk says that a borrower is almost like a slave to the lender. When you borrow money, right, the lender is the one doing you the favor.
I owe you.
Kind of like, yeah, exactly. So therefore, when you're going to create, when the laws are coming to protect one side, whose side should be protected? You should be worrying about the lender's side, not the borrower's side. Okay, so that's what.
You have the contract out there. You're a secret get off of this to the practice and everything, and all the original bank server has everything.
Says the Amar. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Ein halacha lo Rabbi Yehuda v'lo Rabbi Yossi. The halacha, says Rav Huna, not like either one. Now he says this in the name of Rav, and we have the concept of Rav Tanahu Upalig. Historically speaking, Rav lived at the very end of the Mishnah period, very beginning of the Gemara period. He overlaps. So therefore, from time to time, Rav was allowed to disagree with the opinions of a Mishnah. No other time that we say has that privilege. Rav Tanahu Upalig. So despite the fact that we've got two opinions in our Mishnah, Rav has a third opinion. He does not agree with Rav Yehuda. He does not agree with Rav Yossi. So, because Rav Yehuda says, how are we going to solve this problem of the partial payment? The witnesses are going to tear it up and just write a new contract. And Rav Yossi is going to say, we write a receipt. Rav Yossi says, Ella, based in Makar Nashtar V'Kosan L'Shtarcher. The witnesses cannot write the contract. Only a Beis Din can. So what has to happen is they've got to go into Beis Din and they've got to say part of the loan was paid, and the Beis Din certifies and writes the new contract. We're going to see why he holds that. Mizman Rishon, because when is the new contract? The new contract is being written now, but it's relating to a loan that was previous. We had learned in the past that you're not allowed to write a shtar that's predated. You can't write that that's an invalidation of a contract. You can't write a predated contract. This case is you're writing a new contract on an old loan. So I'm writing there's a $50 loan that was made a year ago. Okay, but witnesses have no right to write that contract. You can't write that contract. A Beis Din, even though you really are not supposed to be writing that contract, a Beis Din can, because Beis Din has the rights of Hefker, Beis Din, Hefker. They have ultimate rights of transference of properties. So therefore, if a Beis Din rewrites this contract, they can do that. That's what Rav says is the issue here. You can't have any just plain witnesses saying, oh, well, here's a new contract for a $50 loan. That's very nice, but you can't write a new $50 loan based on the loan. The contract was written before. That was dated on the date of the actual loan. Now you're suggesting we tear that contract up and write a new one dated to the previous date of the previous loan?
But can you write a contract? If I was to borrow for $100 from Jeff,
Yes.
and I said, Jeff, I'm going to give you $50 for that contract, and I'll owe you $50 for that.
Only if you write the contract from today. Right. But we want to write the contract to the backdated to the previous date. Right? That's where the concern is, because this allows the creditor to come, and if there's no money, if this guy doesn't have money, you can go and seize his property that he sold to other people. Okay? So that's what's happening here. So Amar le Rav Nachman le Rav Huna. So Rav Nachman says to Rav Huna, Amri le Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba le Rav Huna. Some said it was Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba said it to Rav Huna. Ishmiya le Rav ha brisa. right? How does Rav understand the following brisa? The Tanya Werner brisa. Edim mekarinis ashtar v'kosim lo shtar acher mizman rishon. Right? This brisa clearly states witnesses are going to tear up the contract and they're going to write another contract from the original date. Hava hadar be. So he says. If sorry, this is what he was saying. He says if Rav had read this brisa, he would have changed his mind because the brisa seems to contradict what he's saying. Okay, Amar Le. So Rav Huna answers back to him, Shmiya Levelo Hadarbe. He learned that brisa. He just didn't change his mind. He doesn't agree. He's an alternate new opinion. He doesn't agree with the Mishnah. He doesn't agree with his brisa. He's a new opinion. Okay, so now why? Bishlama Beidina Alimi Lafkuyi Mamona. I understand because a Beis Din has power. They can take money. In fact, a Beis Din has the power of giving a knas. They can take money from this guy and give it to that guy for no reason.
If you're at the school or at the yeshiva,
by a Beis Din. I would wonder whether those yeshivas that charge knas were their halachic authority to do it. I'm not going to say controversial statements, but I wonder. But maybe it's in your tuition contract there somewhere that you authorize them to take a knas. It could be, but that's a separate. But a Beis Din can do it without any pre-authorization. That's what gives this Beis Din the right, Rav says, to write a predated new contract. Ela edim also shlichuson chosen vosen shlichuson. But witnesses, they did their job. They wrote a contract on a certain date. They can go back and rewrite a contract again based on the original loan. Who gives them the right to do that? Below, but why not? The Hamar Rav Yehuda Marav. Didn't Rav Yehuda say Marav? Edim kosven afilu asor shtaros alsa de achas. So he says, witnesses are allowed to write 10 copies of a contract on a single field, right? They're going to rewrite them. They lost it. They write another contract. They lost it. They write another contract. So Rav Yosef Omer Bishtar Matana. Rav Yosef said, no, that's not always the case. Like we had learned, it's not always the case. You can't always do that. The answer is that only works if the contract being rewritten was a gift contract. Why? Because gift contracts were often commonly given without any sort of mortgage or responsibility to them. Meaning, if I say, hey, I'm going to give you a gift, and that gift is my field. Wonderful, thank you so much. And then a creditor comes and says, hey, he couldn't have given you that field because he owed me money and he didn't have enough money to pay it, so I'm going to take your field back. Okay? You can't go back to the person who gave you the gift and say, okay, I want replacement land or I want more money because it was a gift. So therefore, that's what. So therefore, writing an earlier or predated or duplicate contract is going to have no negative impact. Remember, the only reason why we discussed when we had that whole conversation about rewriting a deed of sale was because this person might pull out a second deed when the guy comes to collect from him and he'll be able to collect from another person. That was the whole rationale.
Even if we get predate the guy saying you owe me money, he owes me money. If it predates it, then he's like possession.
Even if it does, yes.
Really?
You cannot. Gifts are general unless you write it specifically into the gift contract. Gift contracts are presumed to not have any sort of liability to them.
So then I never owned it.
You did own it.
But
did not have liability.
Right. No, I
Free of
Correct. I'm not.
No, but I'm saying
I'm not obligating myself by giving you a property.
But I'm saying if the gift predates the lien.
That was a subject to another argument. The gift predates the lien. You're right. Whether I purchased new property after the lien. The gift predates the lien. It's out of the the person's not going to be able to go get it. The loan is only on what property I'm in possession of at the time of the loan. Right?
No, so that's right.
Correct. Yes. Thank you. Yes, that's correct. Rabbi Amar Bishtar She'ein Bo Achrayus. Rabbi says that another possibility is that we wrote this contract, like we said at the end of the Gemara we learned a couple of days ago, that the contract was a sale, but it was the kind of a sale contract where it was specified that there was going to be no liability from the seller to the buyer. In which case we again created a circumstance where the fact that this person is going to have a predated contract it makes no difference because you're not going to be able to use the date in the contract to be able to go collect property that really was never under the lien in the first place because there's no lien here. So, fine. So now, my Brisa Titania. So what is the what is this whole brisa? We quoted a section of it, which we said was a contradiction to Rav, and we said Rav would have read this brisa, he would have changed his mind. What's the whole brisa? Let's go through this whole brisa as long as we brought it up and explain it. Okay. Let's say there was a case. Somebody was collecting, he was seeking a debt for 1,000 zuz. And the guy, the borrower paid 500. Aiden Mekarinus Ashtar, the witnesses are going to tear up the original contract of 1,000. The Kosun Ashtar Acher Mizman Rishon. And then they're going to write a new contract for 500 from the original dates, because that's when the original loan was. Rabbi Yehuda. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says you can do. Rabbi Yossi says, Shtar zeh yehemunach b'mekomo. You leave the 1,000 zuz shtar. You're going to keep the 1,000 zuz shtar. Veyichtavu shover, and you are going to write a receipt for 500. That's what you're going to be able to do. Shnei dvarim amru kosvin shover. Now, remember, Rav doesn't hold of this, so we're not going to bring Rav's opinion in this. This is just the two other opinions. But we're going to investigate Rabbi Yossi for a moment and talk about these receipts for a moment. Okay. Now, why are we writing this receipt? Two reasons. Achas, the first advantage why Rabbi Yossi likes this idea. Why does Rabbi Yossi not just say tear up and write a new one? Because I like this idea of the receipts. It has two benefits. Benefit number one, number one is, we said that the challenge is going to be that the borrower now has a receipt that he's got to hold on to. And that's going to put undue pressure on the borrower. Says Rabbi Yossi, I like that. I like that undue pressure. You know what that's going to cause? That's going to cause him to pay back the other part of the loan faster. We always want loans to get repaid. So therefore, if this borrower is worried, I'll lose if I don't pay the other 500, I might lose my receipts, and then I'm going to have to pay the full 1,000 again. So then it's going to give him an incentive to get the money and pay the other 500. And that's a good thing, says Rabbi Yossi. So therefore, that's not bad. That's one advantage of the contract, of the receipt. The achas and another, the second thing is that you can use the original contract, the date of the 1,000 zuz contract, that becomes the date from which the lender can collect from other properties, encumbered properties that maybe the borrower may have sold off. In the meantime, he can take those properties that are mortgaged. So now the Gemara is going to say, well, why is that a benefit that Rabbi Yossi has? Rabbi Yehuda nami mizman rishon kama. Rabbi Yehuda also said that when he rewrites the new contract, he allowed the witnesses to write it from the original date as well. So hachi kamar like this is Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. This is what Rabbi Yossi was saying to Rabbi Yehuda. Imizman rishon kamar. If what you're saying is the witnesses wasn't clear what Rabbi Yehuda said. Rabbi Yehuda said we're going to take the original contract, tear it up, and the witnesses are going to write a new contract. Now, he wasn't clear. Rabbi Yehuda, when are you dating that new contract from? If you're going to date that new contract from the original date of the loan, so then poligna Allah bechad. I only have one disagreement with you, and that is that a contract is very useful because it's going to push the borrower to repay faster. Imizman sheni kamart. If you're going to say that this contract requires a new date because it's a new contract, and maybe you're worried about what Rav said, that you can't have witnesses writing a contract that's backdated, that might be problematic. Poligna Allah bitarti, then I'm going to disagree with you on two fronts. Then we're going to have two parts of an argument. Okay, so therefore that's why Rabbi Yossi likes his receipts business. Essentially, it gives a benefit because it pushes the borrower to repay. Tana Rabbanan Rabbi Yisrael Shtarshe Zmano Kosov b'Shabbos o Basra b'Tishrei. Let's say Rashbam gives an example. They use an English date on a contract. They look on the calendar, and the English date on the contract comes out to Shabbos or Yom Kippur. Well, they couldn't have written the contract on Shabbos or Yom Kippur. So what does it mean about this contract? That's what we're going to presume. Shtar me'ucharhu, we're going to presume this contract was written before Shabbos, before Yom Kippur. He's right on it, right? Written before Shabbos and before Yom Kippur, and it's post-dated, right? It was really written on the 9th. They wrote the 10th because it was post-dated. Vikosher. And therefore, as it's a post-dated contract, the contract is valid. Now, we're not going to diver Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yossi posel. Rabbi Yehuda is not going to like this contract. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda is going to ask, V'halo ma'aseh ba Lifanecha betzipori. Wait a second, though. He says there was a case that happened just like this in Tzipori. V'chsharta, and you said the contract was valid. Amar lo, so Rabbi Yossi says, he says, you're right, I did. But it was because specifically it was this case where there was a contract dated for Shabbos or Yom Kippur that I said it was okay. Why? Because everybody's going to look at this contract and know immediately that it's post-dated, and that's going to be okay. The problem that I'm telling you is I never allow post-dated contracts. Right? Why? Right? Rabbi Yossi's post-dated contract is going to be a problem because Rabbi Yossi allows receipts. We're going to see the benefit. We saw the benefit of the receipts, according to Rabbi Yossi. In a moment, we're going to see the extreme problem that Rabbi Yossi's receipts create as long as you allow a post-dated contract. We're going to see in a moment. Now, Rabbi Yehuda, Nami Bezek Kamar, what are you talking about? The whole case was a case. How's this argument? The argument goes, there was a contract that was written on Shabbos or on Yom Kippur. So Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher, Rabbi Yossi says it's puzzle. Wait a second, Rabbi Yossi, you said it was kosher, and he says, oh, no, but only in the case of Shabbos and Yom Kippur. But that was the case. What are you talking about? So I'm a Rabbi Padas. Rabbi Padas says, Hakol modim she'im hus kaknu la'ona social star. Everybody agrees that if the case was that we investigated, and we got the English date, we investigated, we looked into it, and we found that the English date comes out on exactly this date, Shabbos, or on Yom Kippur. Everyone, even Rabbi Yossi, agrees that we would not invalidate that contract. This is a delayed contract, and it is kosher. The argument between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi is whether we allow future post-dated contracts ever in general. The Rabbi Yehuda Latame, Rabbi Yehuda, according to his reason, says, what's the problem? Damar Inkos bin Shover, he says there's no receipts. Therefore, v'lo nafik minei churva, there's nothing wrong with a post-dated contract. The worst thing that happens in a post-dated contract is that I'm gonna lend money on the 1st of Nisan, and then I'm going to write a contract that says the 15th of Nisan. And so therefore, my lien on your property won't begin until the 15th, which means that if you bought new land between the 1st and the 15th, I won't have a lien on it, which I would have otherwise deserved to be able to have because my actual loan predated your purchase. So theoretically, I should have a lien on it, but that's okay because the lender has the right to say, I don't mind. So if the lender says, okay, write a post-dated contract, there's no negative to it. The lender said it was okay. The borrower benefits. Nobody is going to lose their property illegally. There's going to be no new loan, no liens that are illegal created. So what's the problem? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, since there's no receipts are going to make everything, is going to ruin everything. But since there's no receipts, that's perfectly fine. Everything works great. Rabbi Yossi Latame, or Rabbi Yossi, according to his reason, Damar Kosvin Shover, Venofik Minichurba, he says since you write receipts, post-dated contracts present a very significant problem. Here's what the problem is. I write the loan, says I owe you $1,000 on the 1st of Nisan. Then we post-date the contract. It says the 15th of Nisan. The guy, the lender, the borrower says he gets money. He gets his paycheck comes in on the 5th of Nisan, and he says, great, I'm going to repay this. So he goes to the lender, and he says, here's your $1,000 back. Well, the lender says, you know what, I lost the contract. Well, Rabbi Yossi says, no problem. Write him a receipt. So they write a receipt. The $1,000 was repaid on the 5th of Nisan. Great. On the 20th of Nisan, the lender walks into court and takes out a contract that says, I lent this guy money on the 15th of Nisan. I want my $1,000. The guy says, I paid it. And I've got a receipt that says so. The receipt says, repaid 5th of Nisan. He says, how could he have repaid the loan before it was even taken out? That must be for a different loan. So yeah, you'd have to post-date a receipt, right? So, but you can see where the problems, once you start allowing post-dated things, right?
I would think the other concern that he doesn't have security.
But hang on to that because we're going to answer that in a
I would
second.
think the concern that he doesn't have security for 2 weeks. I could sell the house, I could sell the land within that 2 week span, and there's no lien. That
the seller is agreeing. The lender's agreeing to that.
Right. I'm just saying there's
right. The lender's being very generous.
Right.
Right. You could not write this but we never, right? the lender, we could not post data without the lender's permission. That's
Right.
true, right? But the lender's giving us permission. That's why. But according to Rabbi Yossi, even if the lender gives us permission, we don't want to get into this nonsense because it could ruin it for the borrower too. Okay. Amar Rav Huna, brother of Yeshua. Rav Huna, the son of Yeshua, says, "Afilam undamar kosven shover." Even according to the Rabbi Yossi side of things, who says that we can write receipts. Honey mili apalga. That is, we're only going to write receipts on partial payments. Why? Because we're forced to. Right? That's the argument. That we don't like receipts. They're not ideal, but it's only going to be on partial. Why? Because the whole benefit of the receipt was to encourage the borrower to repay the rest. So therefore, it makes sense that it should only be applicable in circumstances where part of the loan is paid, not the entire thing. Avalakule low, but we're not going to say there's $1,000, you pay $1,000, and we're going to allow the guy to say, I lost my contract, and write a receipt for the whole thing. Velohi, but that is not the truth. In fact, afilu kule kasvinon, we're going to write receipts even on fully paid loans. And we're going to use receipts as a fix for when the lender says, I lost my contract. Right? Kihod Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, another circumstance of Yitzchak bar Yosef, have a masik bezuze Rabbi Abba. He had money by Rabbi Abba, and they came to court. Also, coming to Rav Chanina bar Papi, different court this time. They come to Rav Chanina bar Papi's court. Amar le Havli Zuzi, he said, give me my money. Amar le Havli Shtarai, he says, fine, give me the contract. Okay. Veshakul Zuzech, and then you can take your money. Amar le Shtarech Irkosli, he says, I lost the contract. Right? But everybody's agreeing there's a loan here. But the guy's just saying, I don't want to give you the money back because then you'll come back in 2 weeks and ask me for the money again when you find the contract and you'll get it again. So echtov loch tavra. So he says, no problem. I'll write you a receipt. That indicates that you received it. So Marley, Rav Shmuel. He says, but wait a second. Rav and Shmuel, Damri Tarvayu, both of them said, Ein kosven shover. The halach is, we don't write such a receipt. We don't like these receipts. Amar man yahiv lan may afraid the Rav Shmuel Ramina beinayin ba'ainin. He says, if somebody would give me the dust of the feet of Rav and Shmuel, we would rub it in our eyes. Meaning, we hold them in such high esteem. Of course, we hold Rav and Shmuel in such high esteem. We look up to the dust of Rav and Shmuel for sure. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but Rabbi Yochanan for Rish Lakish Damri Tarvayu Kosvin Shover. We've got Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, and they say that you do write receipts. So we got Rav and Shmuel. They're the opinions of Babylonia. Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish were the leaders of Eretz Yisrael. They held not like that. V'chein kiyasa Rabin, and so similarly, when Rabin came from Eretz Yisrael, Amar Rabbi Law, he said in the name of Rabbi Law, Kosvin Shover, we do write receipts. Umistavra de Kosvin Shover, and it makes sense. The halacha is that we're going to write receipts. The Isakadaita Ein Kosvin Shover, because if we were going to say that we don't write a receipt, so now what would happen in this case? How are we going to resolve this? I can't repay you. You can't repay me. You're admitting a loan, but you can't repay me because I don't. Now I got to go find my contract. That's not right. Avid shtaro shel zeh. This guy loses his contract. Zeh yochal hala v'chadi. This guy's going to live and be happy and keep the money his whole life. He's not denying it, but I can't pay. So sorry. When you find your contract, I can't find the contract. So sorry, can't repay you. That's fair. So Maskif lo Abaye. Abaye says ve'elamai. So what's your solution on the other side? Kosvin shover. So we'll write a receipt. Avad shovro shelzeh yochel hala v'chadi. He says. So what's going to happen is the borrower might lose his receipts, and then the lender can come and collect it again, and then he's going to benefit. So sorry, but you lost your receipt. I'm collecting the money again, and now he gets to take the extra $1,000. Why is that fair? Amar le Rava. Rava says in. Yeah, that's fine, because as we said, Evan Lovin Lishmalva, who is the one that we're trying to protect? We're protecting the lender, not the borrower. So if the borrower winds up in the downside here, it's because of this pasuk that says that the lender is always a slave to the borrower. It's 9 o'clock. We're going to stop.
Why
Right
did
here.
you do Shavuot? Like when you said Zeh Omer Shali, Zeh Omer Shali, they always